It's like the term religion of peace. That was just never used of Islam until the 20th century. It's a result of Islam having to exist in modern conditions. The heart of Islam, which includes the call to jihad and violence, is this idea that Muslims are victims.
People would be horrified if they knew the fundamental ideology of Hamas, if they took the time to read what Hamas's charter is. Even a baby is a soldier under Hamas. That's to be put to the service of destroying Israel.
Some Muslims say Islam is peace. They're really very sincere in that. But do the core texts actually support that? If you Islamized society to restore the authority of the life of Muhammad, would that be the outcome? I don't think it would.
Most Muslims don't really know many of the traditions about Muhammad or the Hadith. They haven't imagined Islam. They're told it's good, but they can't tell you why. They're told it's peaceful, but they can't base it on their texts.
In the early church, the verse that was quoted most and that we see the most written on the walls of the catacombs or quoted in the early writers is love your enemies. But in Islam, you have verses which say that the hearts of believers are comforted when they see violence against their enemies. It gives them joy.
Well, Mark and Richard, again, thank you so much for joining us. It's terrific to have this opportunity to talk about something that's actually very important.
Yeah, great to be with you, John.
Likewise, wonderful to be able to talk about these matters.
Let's begin by trying to get right up above what's happening around the world today in tumultuous times when I think people are rightly very concerned, even frightened, about the instability around the place. We in the West, particularly perhaps in Australia, are inclined to think that religion has had its day, and yet the reality is not only are the societies that we live in around the world deeply shaped by the beliefs of our forebears, in reality this is not an age of secularism, it's an age of great ferment over beliefs and values, and sometimes that ferment sort of spills over into great ugliness, frankly. So maybe we could start with something basic as globally, I think it's true to say that both Christianity and Islam claim roughly the same number of adherents, and it's a surprisingly large figure.
Yeah, absolutely. Religion is not on the decline. In fact, it's on the rise, and it profoundly affects the way that people operate. It drives people. I imagine we'll be talking a bit about the Middle East today. That's an area where Islam is obviously centered, but so much of what is going on there is driven ideologically. It's not merely political. It's not merely social. The deep ideological things that drive it, and they are profoundly religious, because that's how we shape our worlds. Our religion tells us what we think is important, how the universe operates, why we're here, and of course religion shapes things. And you're absolutely right. And our contemporary discourse, particularly in the West, is theologically illiterate. We're not given, I don't think our media has the tools to discuss that well, and so they ignore it, and they ignore so many of the factors that are driving what's happening in the world. I agree with you.
Yes, it's just not good enough to say that we don't do religion. And we have a kind of epidemic of religious illiteracy that's afflicted the West. And in fact, I think in retrospect, people will look back on this, the 21st century, and say it was the century of the rediscovery of the power of faith. And we need to equip ourselves to function in this world.
All right, well, let's come to the question of some of the key figures. And remember, and I'm not being rude here, I'm not an expert in Islam. You people both are. So let's not assume too much knowledge on my part or on the part of our listeners and viewers. Just who was Muhammad and what were the circumstances surrounding the origins of Islam and the Quran?
Well, he was a person from Mecca in Arabia. He lived about 600 years after Jesus, and he claimed to be a messenger sent from God to bring guidance to the people, firstly to the Arabs and then to the rest of the world. At that time, the Arabs were placed between the Persian Empire to the east and the Byzantine Christian Empire to the west. And in that context, Muhammad was able to unify the Arabs and use the Arab forces as an army to conquer both to the east and to the west. And he spread his message about the faith that he was proclaiming, the message that he was proclaiming, which is called Islam, or submission to Allah. So that was the beginning, and it was an extraordinary success in many ways. Within 120 years, Muslim armies had conquered all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Portugal and Spain, and also had caused the conquest of most of the Byzantine Empire and the destruction of the Persian Empire as well. So, yes, it was an extraordinary phase in human history.
Would you describe him as a militaristic figure?
Absolutely. Yeah, the history of Muhammad's life is a history of military expeditions, basically. He was the general of the forces of Islam, and sacred violence or sacred warfare is at the heart of Islam's history of success.
So, Mark, just before we come to a couple of questions I want to put to Richard, briefly, the core teaching of Islam about a higher being, God, and what's right and what's wrong, morality, and what happens to us when we die. I know that's a huge question.
Sure.
But briefly.
The core belief is that God is to us as a master is to a slave. And we need guidance from God, which is given by messengers that he sends, in order to know what his requirements of us are. And the essence of morality is submission to Allah, to God, and obedience to all his commands. And Muhammad said he brought that guidance for the world. In the next life, there are two places that people can end up. One is known as the fire, that is hell, and the other is the garden, which is paradise. And I suppose in a nutshell, the basic idea is that if the good that you do outweighs the bad, and if you're a believer and a follower of right guidance, you hope to end up in the garden. But if you are a rejecter of the message of Islam, if you don't follow the guidance that's been sent down, then you have no excuse, and you will end up in the fire. And Islam really calls people to receive this guidance, to obey Allah's commands, and to hope that they will survive the ordeal of death.
How many Islamics or Muslims around the world, can I ask, and Richard will have a view on this as well, I suspect, take those views seriously? A lapsed Muslim who told me that, I won't even say whether it was he or she, that their life was actually in danger here in Australia because they'd publicly renounced their faith, said, I can no longer say that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet because I don't believe that that is true. Is that the essential creed that you have to be able to say? There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet?
Yes, that is the recitation of those words in Arabic is the way in which you become a Muslim. And you're basically saying that there's only one God. That's a core part of Muhammad's message and of Islamic faith. And that the guidance that comes from God comes through this messenger. So that's when you say Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, you're saying, I accept that to be rightly guided as a slave of Allah, I will follow this person's guidance. So that's the heart of it. And if you reject those words, you're considered an apostate, someone who's rejected Islam. And the traditional, the conventional view in Islam of apostates is that they should be killed.
Richard, you've lived and worked, well, you both have, but I know you internationally, particularly amongst Muslims in many parts of the world, as I understand it. There are a lot of people who would say nominally they're Christian, but don't take it very seriously and don't actually believe the great Christian creeds. How true would that be of Muslims? How many take it seriously? And as a subset of that, as a matter of interest, when we see Muslim prayers, it's nearly overwhelmingly men. How often do women go to prayers, and how is there a differentiation between men and women in the faith that you might like to throw some light on?
Yeah, right. So we're talking here about the practice of Islam rather than just the core beliefs, if you like, or the teaching of Islam. And the first one's a great question, particularly to do with nominalism. And there's been quite a bit of research into this, actually, and very roughly, about 25% of Muslims would be, I might use the word keeny beanies, or very full-on traditional conservative Muslims who pursue their faith very strongly and would arguably want their society to be Islamic, to live under Islamic law, to be fully Islamic, if you like. Maybe another 50%, so about half of Muslims, would be traditional Muslims. They're not going to take it that seriously. They may pray 5 times a day. They may pray once a month. They may be the equivalent of Christmas and Easter Christians. They might be Ramadan Muslims who do a few things during the year, and they'll have their Eid, their festivals, but they won't do much else than that. But they will profoundly identify as Muslims. And this is a bit of a difference. When we talk about nominal Christians in the West, what we tend to mean are people who don't take their faith very seriously. But actually, the true sense of the word is my name is Christian, or my name is Muslim. And so even in that total of 75% of people who will identify themselves as Muslim, they will profoundly identify themselves as Muslim. This is my community. These are my people. This is who I am. And yeah, if you betray that community, then that will be taken extremely seriously. There's about another 25% who are not even really nominal. They're atheist or unbelieving, or even the frame is a bit different. They'll be thought of as bad Muslims. They're still Muslim because they're still part of the community, but they're bad Muslims because they don't follow Islam. So that's just a bit of an overview of the community. And in terms of actual prayers, you're right that the men are the ones who bear the most responsibility to go to the public meetings or to go to the mosque and pray there. But there are women who go to the mosque too, and they will pray in a separate space. But very largely in the Muslim community, the public domain is where the men are, and the private domain of the home is where the women are. And a good Muslim woman will be praying regularly there too. But yeah, the mosque is the domain of men generally.
You mentioned that many Muslims would be very committed to seeing their community, their society, even their nation be faithful to Islam. Mm-hmm. That raises the issue of a caliphate, the idea of a caliphate. What is a caliphate, and what percentage of people in the Muslim world would be really committed to a caliphate? As I understand it, just because I may have this wrong, the idea of a caliphate is essentially that the world be Muslim. It's a bit like communists who believe the whole world should be communist, to be fair, I suppose. As a Democrat, I believe the whole world should be, not Democrat in the American sense, but someone who believes in democracy. I think it'd be better if we were all a democracy. In fact, I think it'd be better if we were all Christians.
Yeah, agreed. And that's the... I think all of us, if we think we believe the truth, then we would love people to believe it. So, I don't hold it against Muslims that they would like Islam to be imposed. And that's probably worth people remembering, is that most of the Muslims that I've lived with, they don't want to impose Islam on me to crush me. I think we'll have that effect, but they want to do it for my benefit. It's a very sort of paternalistic view of trying to impose it. But going back to Caliphate, Mark said before that Islam originated with Muhammad as the leader, and he was militaristic, but he was bigger than that. He wasn't merely a general. He was a judge. He was effectively a president. He ruled. And then the Muslim ideal would be that there would be a follower who would keep doing that. And the Caliph was just, in a sense, the next global Muslim leader. And that's the ideal in Islam. Now, there's been lots of different attempts to try and create that caliph. Straight after Muhammad, there were a number of leaders who led the entire Muslim community, but pretty quickly it splintered. But that's the ideal, to have Islamic law ruling ultimately the globe, but at least ruling society, and have an Islamic leader of that society. And that is the goal, certainly the goal of traditional conservative Sunni Islam.
I once had the opportunity to ask Saif Gaddafi, son of Colonel Gaddafi of Libyan fame. He was in Australia and I met him. Whether, and I use the words, a practicing, believing Muslim could really embrace the idea of democracy, or whether they actually believed in a theocracy. And he said, we plainly believe in a theocracy. You don't need the machinery of democracy. This is a shorthand answer. It took him half an hour to deliver it. Because, in fact, what we actually need is to follow Muslim law, so you only need judges to interpret it. There are parallels, I think, in the Old Testament. You may care to comment on that. But it was an interesting statement, and it's often left me wondering just how easy it is for many Muslim folk to embrace the idea of participatory democracy.
Yeah, it's a great question. Technically, what Muslim scholars would say is they wouldn't say it's a theocracy. They'd say it's a nomocracy. So it's a rule by law, but you're right, it's divine law, and it assumes that the Quran is the divine law. So we'll impose those laws. But they will attempt, and particularly when the modern world emerged, particularly in the Industrial Revolution and when the West became powerful, many in the Muslim world looked at the West and said, this is great. We want the benefits, but we would like to be Islamic. And so there's been the project, it's called Islamic modernism, trying to reconcile traditional Islam with the modern world. And Muslims have been trying to do that for a long time. And part of that project is, can democracy work with Islam? And you'll have a range of people who try and pull it off. Tariq Ramadan would be one example. He's a Swiss Muslim scholar. But it's nearly always failed, because the DNA of traditional Islam is not democratic, it is authoritarian. As Marx said, that's who Muhammad was, that's the nature of the faith. The DNA of the faith is that it is an imposition of law by force if necessary. And it resists democracy because people don't get an opinion on that.
The purpose of government is to impose Islam.
Yeah.
That is the classical medieval and still present today view. And the more radically minded brethren amongst Muslims regard democracy as a kind of idolatry, or shirk, as it's called. That is, it's giving people authority over their affairs when only God should have authority. Only God should make laws, not people. And so it's considered to be an idolatrous practice. This is by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all those radical groups. Hamas would have the same view.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's well known as someone who was a Muslim, became an atheist and is now a professing Christian, was asked once when she'd written a book calling for the reformation of Islam, what that might look like. And the questioner said, we had a reformation in the Christian church and it was about sola scriptura. What happens if you go to sola scriptura in Islam? And she rather shockingly said, you end up with ISIS.
Well, Walid Ali, the well-known media figure and academic in Melbourne, once said that Islam's had its reformation and it's produced Al-Qaeda. That is, the idea of reform is to go back to your roots and to restore the roots. That's what the medieval idea was in the Christian church. And Islam has been going through that process and it has produced Islamic radicalism. So it's really a very difficult thing to try and find kind of modernizing influences in the core texts of Islam that will counter the radical, violent themes. So, yeah, that's the challenge. Some people think of the Western Christian Reformation as a kind of softening of religion, a retreat of religion, but that's not what it was. It was a restoration of the role of the scriptures in faith and of the example of Christ. And when you restore Muhammad's standing and role and example in contemporary life, you don't get a kind of secularization of Islam, you get a radicalization of Islam.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why it doesn't really work is because, and this is another quite significant difference between Christianity and Islam, is Christianity really centers on the person of Jesus and your beliefs about him, but it's very principled. So the law, if you like, of Jesus is love. Love your neighbor, love God. And then you, in a sense, you work that out for your place, your culture. But Islam is very much an orthopraxic religion. You have to do these things. It's very practical. All you do is you follow the law, and the law is entirely comprehensive over almost every aspect of life. And Muhammad is the perfect example of what that looks like. He's the model practitioner of Islam. And so what you're doing is you're copying him. And so, as Mark says, what Reformation will look like is going back to following what Muhammad did, the way he ran the society, the way he lived his life, the way they did family, the way they did everything. And that looks a lot like 7th century Arabia, which doesn't look even slightly democratic or slightly modern. So it just doesn't work.
Richard, can I follow that for a moment? I know you both have interacted with vast numbers of Muslim people, and you've done so in a winsome and loving way. I think both of you deserve a great deal of credit for being deeply concerned to draw alongside Islamic people from what I know of your life and your works. And I've had the opportunity to talk to Mark at length about what he does over many decades, as I said in the introduction. Not so much you, Richard, but I know what you've been doing. It often strikes me that there must be many, many, good, decent Muslim people who are really worried about the radicalisation of their faith, reformation in one way, if you like, back to the basics, and what it means. How do good, decent Australian Muslims, for example, come to grips with the reality that, let's be frank about this, many Australians are becoming very worried about radical Islam in our midst?
Yeah, so it is certainly true that, again, like I said before, maybe only 25% of Muslims would be actively, conservatively wanting to impose Islam on people, or at least supporting that. I think the actual number of people who are working hard at it is much smaller. Maybe 2% are properly Islamist in an activist way, but 25% of people will support that project. But the remaining 75% of Muslims are very sensitive to that, and are very conscious of trying to, you might call them liberal, or at least certainly not Islamist, and they are trying to do a delicate dance of trying to be an Australian, trying to be a Muslim, trying to resist that radical shaping of their communities. But as we've just talked about, the problem is that they don't really have the support of their scriptures. Like, you can't argue for that based on Islam. You only really can argue for it based on practical, trying to get along with people in your society grounds. And so, yeah, they hope for that. Most Muslims don't want that, but they can't win that discussion because it doesn't actually fit with what their religion is teaching.
Muslims can experience quite a lot of cognitive dissonance. So you believe that Muhammad is the best example. So what your understanding of goodness is, you project on Muhammad. He must have been kind, he must have been wise and gentle and all these things that we admire, and loving. But the reality of the core texts of Islam are different. So sometimes when a society goes through a process of radicalizing because people want more Sharia, because they've been taught that Sharia is good, they're shocked at what that actually looks like, as happened in Iran. And so the cognitive dissonance is this gap between the core text and what I think Islam ought to be. And so that's why when some Muslims say Islam is peace, they're really very sincere in that. But do the core texts actually support that? If you Islamized society to restore the authority of the life of Muhammad, would that be the outcome? I don't think it would. So that's the great challenge really for Muslims. It's not easy being a Muslim.
Yeah, most Muslims don't know Islam. Most Muslims, their theological education, they go to Friday school, the equivalent of Sunday school at church, and that would be over by the time they're 12. Most of the thing they've been doing there is just memorizing the Quran in Arabic. They're not learning to think theologically. They're not reading anything other than the Quran. They're not reading their theologians. They're not reading. Most Muslims don't really know many of the traditions about Muhammad or the Hadith. They might know one or two of their favorite ones, but they know almost nothing about the person of Muhammad, the story of Islam, the details of what the theologians are actually saying. And I think Mark's right. They have an imagined Islam. They're told it's good, but they can't tell you why. They're told it's peaceful, but they can't base it on their texts.
Can I ask then, you just touched on it then, I think, the core text. It's not just the Quran. I've not read the Quran. I've read bits of it, but I haven't read the Quran. I've read bits of the Hadiths as well, which I understand have equal importance. You wouldn't say that of any books in Christianity. The Bible is regarded as the authority. But I understand in the Islamic world, the Hadiths have equal standing with the Quran. That's question one. What are the Hadiths? Question two is, like the Old and the New Testament, again, I've not read it. I'm not trying to be smarter than I am here, because I'm not smart on this one. But my understanding is that the Quran paints a very different picture of the Muhammad when he was not in a position of power, in a military sense, if you like, to the second picture we get in the latter part of the Quran, where he actually is in a dominant position and actually behaves quite aggressively.
Yes, hadiths are recordings of things that Muhammad or his companions did or said that were passed down, it is believed, and then written down a few hundred years after Muhammad. So these are gathered together in collections, which are organized for legal purposes. So if you put the 6 major collections together on your shelf, you'd probably have about 2 meters of books. So it's a lot of materials, thousands and thousands of things that Muhammad said and did. And these are considered to be the record of Muhammad's best example to follow. So they are the foundation of Islamic law. In fact, most of Islamic law rests more on the hadiths than the Quran, which is sort of more theological, nowhere near as much detail about how to live. But they're both important. So when you say, I believe Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, you're in a way embracing the hadith, the traditions, because that's where the record of Muhammad's standing and status as a messenger is passed on to us alongside the Quran. They belong together. It's like a body and a backbone. The two can't be separated from each other. With regard to the second question, the so-called Meccan surahs, the chapters of the Quran that were from Muhammad's Meccan period, are less violent. The Muslims are in a minority, they're vulnerable, and they're sort of having to get on with their neighbors who are somewhat threatening to them and even persecuting them. And then the later surahs, which are the Medinan surahs, when Muhammad had moved to Medina with his small band of followers, he establishes an Islamic state. And then you have more violent verses, so calls to warfare. So you could say earlier on, the Quran says, seek peace, forgive and overlook the unbelievers. But then later it says you can defend yourself, and then it says you can be aggressive within limits, and then finally it says you can conquer unbelievers without limits. So you've got this transition in the Quran from more accommodating verses to more violent ones. And there's 2 ways to think of this. One is that the later verses abrogate or cancel the earlier ones. So that's a classic view, in conventional view in Islam. So the enduring message of the Quran then is that Muslims should fight to establish Islam, use violence, and so the later ones cancel the earlier ones. And this is called abrogation. But another view, which I think is more practical, which was expressed by Sheikh al-Buti, a leading Syrian Sunni scholar, is that actually all of the Quran is available, and it depends on your circumstances. For example, if you're living in a minority situation and you're vulnerable and you're dependent on the surrounding population for your security, the Meccan verses apply. But if you're in a position where you do have power and you have military power and you can win the battle, then the Medinan verses apply, and you're obliged to use that power and that force to advance Islam. So there's this very flexible and accommodating framework the Quran offers to Muslims depending on their circumstances. And I think that's probably, that's in effect how Islam tends to work in the world today.
That brings us, in my mind, to the question then, if we're looking to the founders or the first people, if you like, in each of these great faiths that we look to, Jesus versus Muhammad, we know they both existed. Let's establish that. They both had very profound impacts on the world today, and it's ongoing. That's why we're having the discussion, because we're saying to people, wake up. As you said, Mark, it's not good enough to say we don't do religion. We won't understand the world before us and its complexities and its problems, let alone be able to solve them if we don't get to the bottom of this. So they're plainly very, very different figures. That's part of what you're painting. One eschews violence. He's looked to by his followers to fight a good fight, to help the Jewish people break free of the Romans, and he refuses to do it. He will not pick up the sword. He specifically says, put your sword down when somebody draws a sword to defend him. The other is a very different picture indeed. So how might you neatly summarise for viewers the great difference in an age when, again, this problem of not knowing anything about faith, people say all religions are the same, implying that Muhammad and Jesus were both great forces for the same sort of outcomes?
I'll have a crack. In a nutshell, Muhammad is profoundly human, and he's a human leader, and he's as we've been saying, he's a general, he's a politician, but he's profoundly human, and he claimed to have a message from God that he delivered to people. But again, he also claimed to have no part in that message whatsoever. He's just a human. Whereas Jesus, on the Christian understanding, Jesus is God coming to visit us in person. So they are entirely different people. But not just that, also the problems, if you like, that they're trying to solve are radically different too. Muhammad came to impose laws on people to create a good society because people can pull off laws. People are good inherently. There's no fundamental problem. We just need to keep the laws. Our problem, as Mark said, we're built to be law followers. All we need is guidance, and we'll pull it off. We'll create a great society. Jesus came saying, actually, no, humans have deep and profound flaws, and they're heart-level flaws, and we don't just need guidance. What we need is a resurrection. We need to be made alive in new ways and fresh ways, and we need to be profoundly transformed, which is why he didn't pick up a sword, because the sword was never going to never fix the problem. The problem is a heart, and so he came with a heart solution. So radically different people, but also radically different tasks, if you like, and projects.
Yeah, I agree with Richard. And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, but Muhammad's kingdom was very much of this world. I think one of the deepest differences I discern is their responses to rejection. Both Jesus and Muhammad suffered a lot of rejection of different kinds from family and others even. Jesus' response to rejection was gentleness and suffering, but resurrection. Death was defeated. There's a lovely verse in Matthew where it says that he will bring justice to victory through gentleness, through not putting out a smouldering wick or breaking a bruised reed. Muhammad was very different. His responses to rejection were very human. They included revenge and violence and the comforting of the heart through violence against others. So that they're just very, very opposite. And I think one of the most powerful reasons why some Muslims turn to Christ is the encountering Christ, reading the life of Christ and understanding how different he is from their lived experience. So, yeah, I think it's a huge question for the world today. Who will you follow? Will you follow Muhammad or will you follow Jesus? Just one more thought. It's certainly not true that all religions are the same. And the postmodern lie that you can make anything out of any text is also not true. These foundational texts, the lives of Christ, the life of Muhammad, the life of Christ, the life of Muhammad, are profoundly influential. And whether we like it or not, the question that we are being asked is, will we follow Jesus or will we follow Muhammad? Or who else will we follow? This is a fundamental question for our age.
An interesting way of putting it, to my way of thinking, if I can put you both on the mat, might be to say all of us crave love. I think deep down, we really want to be unconditionally loved. We know we're not really worthy of being loved, but we want to be loved. So if I were to say to you, who does the God of the Bible or Jesus love, and who does Allah love? Does that throw light on, does that help contrast?
Absolutely.
Two faiths. Who does Jesus love and die for? Who does Muhammad love and accept?
Yeah, well, there's a friend of mine. He was a Muslim who came to faith. He's actually from Somalia, and he was being taught religion in his school. There was only one page on Christianity. They weren't allowed to have Bibles. It was a Muslim context, but there was a page on Christianity, and there was just one Bible verse written there, which was John 3:16, "For God so loves the world." And that's all he had. And he just thought, hang on, that's different. That's wrong. God loves the world, because in Islam it teaches God loves those who love him, and that's it. But here it was in the Bible saying God loves the world. God loves all people. God loves us prior to us performing well or poorly, being religious or irreligious. God just loves us, and he loves us enough to want to reconcile with us even when we're his enemies. That's the massive difference. Islam, there is that sense of love, but yeah, God will only love those who love him. And by the way, there's something, Mark, again, he's talked about the model. It's entirely accurate. In Islam, you are a slave of a master. And so even then, the nature of love you're getting there is radically different. In Christianity, God is your father, you are his child. Like it's levels of difference, profoundly far more intimate and rich and beautiful, the image of love that you have in the Bible and the relationship that is possible with God. And for Muslims, that's unimaginable that you could have that degree of intimacy. In Islam, God is always Allahu Akbar. He's always greater and transcendent and untouchable. In fact, one of the greatest theologians in Islam, Al-Ghazali, said God is unknowable, always. He's always unknowable. He's too transcendent. So it's a radically different view of love.
I agree. In the Quran, God loves those who love him. And, in the early church, the verse that was quoted most and that we see the most written on the walls of the catacombs or quoted in the early writers is love your enemies. And it was quoted most because the church was persecuted and people needed to know that. What should they do about the people that were hating them and persecuting them? And this is so profound. It's a complete, transformation of human life to love your enemies. But in Islam, you have verses which say that the hearts of believers are comforted when they see violence against their enemies. It gives them joy to see violence. And we saw, expressions of great joy after the October 7 massacre last year. That celebrating of the destruction of an enemy in the most cruel and violent way. So it's very, very different. And I agree with what Richard said. It's so profound that the God who loves all of us, because he's our Father, he's created us, we can have a personal relationship with the loving God. But in Islam, the love is the love of the master for the slave. It's not personal. It's not relational in that way. And I think Islam struggles with the impersonality of God and the separation between humankind and God. But there it is. It's kind of hardwired into the Quran and the core texts of Islam. It creates a very, very different society.
I think it's almost beyond questioning that the idea of loving your enemy and of turning the other cheek is associated with Christianity, and it's had a massively influential impact on how our Western societies have slowly evolved. Your enemy is worthy of a vote even if you disagree with them and wish they had no say in the way your society is run. Your enemy is entitled to the same protection at law. You may see that person as inferior, but as a former Prime Minister of Australia, Robert Menzies, put it, all souls are equal in the eyes of heaven. There's no graduation between king and the most humble janitor. They all matter. That, I think, is quite unique, and it's different to all of the other religions, but in particular, I would posit to Islam.
Yes, that's right. I think freedom of speech is dependent on love your enemies. If you really strongly disagree with someone and even think their ideas are pernicious, it doesn't mean you should punch them in the face. You're allowed to, vehemently disagree and work out issues in the Western tradition without hating people. But Islam has trouble with that. It has trouble accepting dissent. The response to dissent is to suppress it violently. So the concept of freedom of speech, I think, is fundamentally grounded in the love your enemy teaching of Jesus. And insofar as Western nations are stepping away from Christ, they're also losing the instinct for freedom of speech. We see that in many different ways.
It's also fundamentally undergirded by an Islamic anthropology. Like, what it is to be a human is very different in Islam. It's not merely that your status before God is that he's created you as a slave or a servant, but you are not made in the image of God. That is deeply Christian teaching. In fact, the Quran denies that, or Islam denies that, because that is in some way, Mark mentioned before, this sin of Islam is shirk, associating anything with God. And so the idea that we are in any way an image of God or somehow like God is entirely offensive to Islam. But it's the grounding of a Christian view of what it is to be human and why we're so valuable and why even our enemies are valuable, because they are made in the image of God. They're precious, and we see something of who God is in them, and we know that he loves them. There's none of that in Islam.
Instinctively, it's incredibly hard to love somebody who vehemently disagrees with you, particularly if they become personal. I think maybe our culture, this is a bit of a cul-de-sac, but I just wanted your views on it because there'll be people asking this at the moment. And then I'll come to another hard question for us, if you like, on the Christian side of the divide. But there would be many who would say, it's just naive and silly. And in an age when love is often just sort of thought of as a feeling about emotions, it really has to be seen as a doing thing, doesn't it? Sometimes through gritted teeth, you have to say, I so vehemently disagree with that person, I want to punch their lights out, but I need to remember that a higher authority has said that person matters as much as I do. It's not always an easy thing to do. It's very, if you like, counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is. It's contrary to human nature. I had a conversation with some Muslim friends. They said, when we grew up, we were taught that if someone looked at you funny, you should punch them first before they punched you, And they were speaking of living in a context of constant insecurity and threat and stress. And but the human heart kind of pushes people to think in those ways. It's huge. Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies is completely transformative of the whole way we think. It's not straightforward. And one of the interesting things about that is that the Bible teaches us that humans are flawed. That we're not naturally good. We're torn with evil, and that means that we can have a realistic approach to governance and to building a healthy society. Whereas Islam doesn't have that view. Islam actually believes that you can use force to make people good, and it just doesn't work. It fails again and again. Every time an Islamic revolution has been attempted in the last half century, they've produced corrupt societies and violent, terrifying societies. So, yeah, the record of Islam in bringing utopia in has not been good at all.
Yeah, and love is always risky. Even loving people who like us back has risk because you're giving of yourself in a way that might not be returned. But it doesn't have to be naive or foolish. John, you probably know this better than me or remember where it's from, but I think it was Abraham Lincoln, who said, don't we destroy our enemies when we make them our friends? And he did that after there was a vicious US election that he was involved in. This current one isn't the first time that there's been vicious American elections. And afterwards, he, if I remember it correctly, he appointed his opponent who said horrible things about him. He appointed him, I think, as Secretary of State in his administration. And he was told, what are you doing? This guy hates you. And he said, no, I destroy my enemies by making them my friends.
That's correct.
Yeah, and you could say there's a naivety to that or a risk to that, absolutely. But in a sense, there's Christianity, or the heart of Christianity is that God wants to reconcile enemies. And that's the way you destroy your enemy. You don't destroy it by crushing him or her. You destroy them by reconciling with them. And yeah, it's risky to do that. And it might always go well. And it might be costly, but that's not naive. It is idealistic and it's beautiful, but it's not naive.
So now to raise the question that some of our listeners will be understandably thinking of, they'd be saying, what about the Crusades? Were the Crusades a lapse in the Christian leadership of the time's capacity to love their enemies? Or was there a place for opposing the advancement of Islam with the sword? Then you think of the Inquisitions, you think of the times when Christians have got it profoundly wrong. How do we make sense of those great historical, if you like, moments that are often used to argue a case of moral, even spiritual equivalency?
Yeah, let me start with a story, and then I'll hand it. Mark's the guy who's the politician guy, or the politics guy. But let me tell a story. So when I lived in Egypt, I would introduce myself to people, and obviously my name's Richard, and the great crusading king was King Richard, and I'd say, "Hi, I'm Richard," and again, the response would be, "Oh, Qabl Asad, Qabl Asad, Qabl Asad." They were excited. Qabl Asad means heart of lion, heart of lion. It was fascinating. He's a hero because that's what kings do. In the Middle Eastern world, the goal of being a good king is to be an honorable warrior who fights for your kingdom, if you like, and religious too. You're a religious warrior fighting for your kingdom. Now, it's not Christian to do that. Certainly not if you think you're imposing Christianity or people, because Christianity is a heart thing. It's not a law thing. But it is interesting in the Muslim world, that's sort of how they operate. And so whatever we critique it as an exercise in Christianity, it's certainly, for the time, that's how politics operated. And that was the world they were fighting in. And also at the time, the Islamic Empire was expanding westwards into Europe. And so at least the initial stages was a pushback. And maybe one little other comment is, so much of what we imagine about the Crusades is not accurate. The history is very complex and detailed. At times, the Muslims were allied with the Christians against the Jews. Alliances would change. So it was a complex political period in history. And it may well have been a failure from a kingdom perspective, if you like, as a Christian. But it's certainly the way the world operated at that time.
The big question in history, of course, is what if? What if the Allies had not won the Second World War, etc.? What if the Crusades had not taken place, Mark? What might have happened?
The ancient world was considered, the Christian world was considered to have 5 major Christian centres: Alexandria in Egypt, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople and Rome. And 3 of those were conquered within a century, and the 4th, some centuries later, Constantinople. Only Rome of the ancient Christian centres remains unconquered. So from the perspective of Christian Europe, the Holy Land, as people call it, was occupied by Islam, and Muslims were harassing, sometimes killing, torturing pilgrims who were seeking to go to visit these holy sites. And so the Crusaders believed they were fighting a law of decolonizing the Middle East from Arab Muslim conquest and a war of liberation. If what was happening was that Islam was advancing, and eventually Constantinople fell and the Byzantine Empire was destroyed. And if there hadn't been military resistance, then all of Europe at some point would have been conquered. This was the case with the Muslims coming through Spain as well. That there was a fight, a reconquista. There was a battle to win back that territory. And so yes, if there'd been no Crusades, the Jihad would have continued. Like, the Jihad wasn't a response to European aggression. It pre-existed it. It's because of the Jihad that these areas became Islamic. So, yeah, I think the Crusades has become a kind of like a catch cry with not a lot of meaning behind it anymore. And I think at some point, nations and societies that want to survive need to be able to defend themselves.
You mentioned jihad. Well, let's go back to some terms and describing them. We hear it used here, and we hear people in the streets of Australia glorifying the idea of jihad. Now, I've heard some Muslims say this refers to the internal spiritual struggle to be holy, which is something Christians and Muslims would, at least in the broad, identify with. But others see it as a violent waging of war against non-Muslims. How do we understand jihad?
If you pick up a collection of hadiths, these are traditions of Muhammad, there are a number of books of covering different topics, a book on marriage, a book on this and that. There'll be a book on warfare. And the book on warfare is always called the Book of Jihad. In Islamic jurisprudence, jihad as a technical term refers to warfare against unbelievers to advance the cause of Islam. That's an age-old fact. It's reality. The problem for Islam in the world, in the modern world today, is that to have a faith that regards fighting as a fundamental precept of the religion is obviously hugely problematic. It makes your position insecure. It makes you a threat. It's difficult. And there's the cognitive dissonance of how to live in the world with that. So one of the responses to that is to say, oh no, jihad is not that. And so people use a hadith which says that jihad is this personal internal struggle, but actually that tradition has never been accepted as reliable by Muslim scholars. And in any Islamic textbook, the chapter on jihad is about taking captives and killing and how to fight. So it's a misrepresentation of Islam, I think. Hamas is not under the illusion that jihad is just an internal personal struggle. It understands only too well that it's a battle against infidels. So this is a great deception. It's like the term religion of peace. That was just never used of Islam until the 20th century. It's a result of Islam having to exist in modern conditions that an apologetic needs to be put forward to say that Islam is peaceful, tolerant, and doesn't have violence. But many Muslims have spoken out against this trend, leading Muslim scholars. So it's just not credible, but it's sort of forced upon Muslims trying to exist in the modern world.
Yeah, and again, it's undergirded by a wider theology. It's not just the word, but if Islam is law to be enforced, then traditional Islam says you can use all the apparatus of government to enforce it. You can use the police to enforce it. You can use the army to enforce it.
Correct.
You can use force legitimately. The only debate in the Muslim communities, it's not a debate about whether you can use force or not. The only debate is what's the appropriate place to use force, or what's the appropriate force to use in this context. So, yeah, there's never been any dispute that jihad has been a battle in a genuine militaristic sense. Absolutely.
Can I tell you a story about this? That when the civil war broke out between East and West Pakistan, it created a theological dilemma because, strictly speaking, in Islam, you should only fight against infidels. It's forbidden for Muslims to fight against Muslims, and warfare should be for Islam. So what happened was the West Pakistani theologians declared that the East Pakistanis were infidels. And so it became a holy war. And then you can kill the infidels and rape them as well. And hundreds of thousands of women in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, were raped. It was very traumatic. But it's an example of the dilemma of a nation that wants to go to war and has this religious demand that war should be to advance Islam. And that created huge trauma for the Bangladeshis. It was a tragic episode, but an example of how the power of Islam to shape national consciousness and awareness around violence.
We understand it was Pakistani men who engaged in the dreadful, dreadful grooming and then rape and massive violence against hundreds of poor white girls in England, and it was covered up. And it does appear that a lot of people wanted to cover it up lest they be seen as Islamophobic, lest they be seen as racist. How would those men justify their appalling behaviour?
I've been thinking and writing about this, speaking about it for a long time. The victims are in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. There's a number of factors that come together, and it's interesting to look at the testimonies of survivors. One is that it's a religious element, so it's the religiously motivated hate crime. That is, the girls who were being raped were told they were filthy infidels and they were inferior, and they were suffering because of they're dehumanized in the eyes of the men. Another issue is that under Islamic law, conquered non-Muslims live in a state of vulnerability. They're meant to be subjected and dominated by Islam, but if they break out of that domination, they're vulnerable to the jihad. And one of the conditions of jihad is that the rape of captive women is permitted. They become slaves of their captors. This is well known, and it's part of Islamic law. And so, in societies like Pakistan or Egypt, Christians live in a state of vulnerability, and one of the things that hangs over their head is the threat of rape, if they're considered to have broken the law. And so there's this huge problem in Egypt and in Pakistan of Christian girls being abducted and forcibly married off. The state will not defend them. And so, you've got this worldview that if you're not a Muslim, you're inferior, you're dirty, this is among a particular group of Muslims. Not all Muslims would think like that, but some do. And so this legitimizes this. And moreover, you've come from a culture where there's a tradition of taking, sometimes a history of taking non-Muslim girls and using them. And so these factors, these religious factors, produce an outcome that Islam itself forbids. I don't think Islam gives permission for men in the UK to do this to girls at all. It's horrendous. But the culture of Islam does set up these parameters. One of the things I've found most distressing in thinking about these events in the UK is that it is religiously motivated, but so often when people write about it, we don't even have the language to talk about that. So people speak about race crimes or ethnicity. In fact, some of those rape gangs were not Pakistani. They were Arab Muslims, but not necessarily Pakistanis. It's not just an ethnic issue; it's a religious issue. But we don't have a term for the equivalent of racism for religion. What do you call religionism? There's not even a word for it. This is one of the kind of gaps that we have in our language, in our worldview, to talk about a religiously motivated hate crime. So this is, the religious illiteracy of the elites in the UK go together with this determination to impose multiculturalism, combined with Islam's sense of dominance and superiority. It's a very toxic mix, which created a massive tragedy for the UK, which will take a long, long time to recover from.
I would make a charge that I'd like to test by you, which is that our political elites in the West constantly tell us of the dangers, indeed the evil idea that we should be horrified by if we discovered it in ourselves, that we're Islamophobic. Yet their reaction tells them that they were Islamophobic. They didn't want to expose. They were afraid to expose, for all sorts of reasons, what was going on. The very people telling us that, oh no, we should avoid Islamophobia, are in fact displaying a fear of the consequences of exposing some of the behaviour that's justified, to be blunt, by Islamic belief.
Yes, there's, when an animal is facing a frightening situation, you have that classical response. Do you fight or do you flee? Fight or flight. But there's another response, which is to lick your aggressor's feet. Befriend and tend. So I think one analysis of what's happened in the UK and indeed in the West is that people are frightened. They're frightened of Islam. They're frightened of this aggression, all the threats, And so they take a path of least resistance, and that path involves tending and befriending. It means giving large amounts of money to support Islamic projects. It means years, decades of sensitivity, training to the police to avoid any actions that might be construed as Islamophobic. And a kind of fear gets imposed and built into the structures of society and culture. Now, what I find really disturbing is that this is actually quite normal in, say, a country like Egypt or Pakistan, that there's a tending and befriending, a supporting of Islamic cause. But it's disturbing to see this being projected into the West, and through a set of, a perfect storm of cultural and ideological trends, the West has become vulnerable to buying into Islamic superiority and Islamic dominance.
Why has the left identified so closely with Islamic belief? You see it everywhere. You gentlemen may have a different view, and I won't ask you to comment, but I think the ABC is profoundly left. They have, I think, been amazingly soft in exposing Hamas and their atrocities. Why would anybody think that the idea that queers should be for Palestine? We know it happens to homosexuals in that culture. Why do phase 3 feminists never appear to complain about the way in which women are treated, and in fact that law have less standing than men in the Islamic world? The left, in short, is profoundly hostile to Christianity, but unbelievably obliging to Islamic belief and practice, which often offends the very things that they say they believe in.
Yeah, and we could add another question. Why is Islam happy to be on their side as well? Because Islam is proactively anti-gay, not anti-women, but anti-feminism. But they're happy to reap the benefits of the contemporary political space where, and this is a much bigger conversation, and you've covered a lot of it in some of your other podcasts, but if you're in a context where the most oppressed person is the winner, or has the most moral value, or the most to be honoured, however you want to frame it, then that's all you end up with. You end up with, or in a world where everything's colony or anti-colonizing. So Christianity is bad because they're the colonizers. Israel is bad, they're the colonizers. Or whatever the actual reality is and the historical truths. It's driven by a really incoherent political philosophy that we're operating under, that the West is operating under. It makes no sense. It's completely incoherent to ally Islam with anti-colonialism or feminism, but it's just super shallow reading of it. But they are a minority, and they are making a claim that of Islamophobia, so they must be right. They must be the goodies in the battle. Yeah,
may I offer 3 suggestions for causes?
Yeah, offer a careful response, not a.
No, this is crazy.
Yeah, right.
One is resentment of Christianity. They share that. There's been a long battle against the Christian view of the person in the West, going back to Rousseau, so it's a long way back. The idea that human beings have inherent evil that they need to overcome, this is not something the left accepts, believes in the inherent goodness of people. And that's my second point is that it's a similar anthropology. Islam believes that people are basically okay. They just need a bit of guidance. And I think the left has a very similar view. Through education, through government, through control, we can create good societies because people are basically good. Then the fundamental problem is not the human being. It's unjust structures in society that can be addressed. But the Western Christian tradition is based on the idea that humans are fundamentally problematic. And that's why we have a separation of powers, for example. It's to moderate the effects of human sin. The left in general doesn't like the separation of powers, and it kind of works away to break down the distinction between the law and politics. So there's a similar anthropology. But the biggest reason, I think, is that Islam is intensely attuned to victimhood. When Muhammad responded badly to rejection, he became the ultimate victim, and he justified the jihad in terms of Islamic victimhood. It's better to kill than to be persecuted. The Quran sort of says that. and repeats it. So Islam is oriented to victimhood, and this is actually a big problem, ethical problem, I think, for many Muslims, that the Islamic world is obsessed with victimhood and is blaming someone. If we blame the Jews, or we blame the West, or we blame somebody else for our issues, and there's an exaltation of victimhood, because at the heart of Islam, which includes the call to jihad and violence, is this idea that Muslims are victims. I saw that in a debate between Wafa Sultan, an Arab dissenter, and an Algerian professor, and she was saying, look, Muslims have hurt some people as victims of Muslim movements. And he began to scream at her, and he shouted and said, we are the victims. We are the victims. Your victims are in the hundreds, maybe thousands, but ours are in the millions. So this is a really strong kind of psychological frame that Islam inculcates in order partly to justify the violence. And where every war then becomes a war of liberation, of Islamic victimhood. And the West is attuned to that as well. The left is attuned to that as well. The left is all about the victimhood and rescuing victims and getting rid of oppressors. So there's this kind of recognition, a spark of similarity from completely different places, but there's an alignment over a shared anthropology, a dislike of the Christian tradition, and an orientation to victimhood that becomes inflammatory. And that's why we've seen that in the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia, this theme of victimhood, which then allies to a kind of hatred that's so destructive and corrosive.
Yeah, I agree with that. But also there is an incoherence in it, in the sense of, and you're starting to see this in the left, as they're now battling each other to have the right amount of outrage or the right amount of response to the right amount of people. Like, it's the sort of race to the bottom in terms of who's the biggest victim is a bit of an endless race. And so there's a political pragmatism. The enemy of my enemy is my friend for a while, until they become my enemy. And then there's this and we're starting to see the dog eat dog side of that as well. And so it's an uneasy alliance, I think, and it's politically convenient, particularly politically convenient for Muslims to play a victim card in the Australian context. But yeah, I think it's a very uneasy alliance that's very fragile.
It certainly goes to this heart of the lack of logic that we've touched on. People are not thinking this through clearly. It's intellectually and morally indefensible, I think, to avoid stating a blunt reality. Has anyone been more victimised than the Jewish people down through the ages, and in particular in the last century? Anyone? Have any people been more victimised than the Jews? We've just had the 80th anniversary of the Holocaust, and yet they are painted as victim makers, both by Muslims and by the left, and logic and fair play and the things that are under your nose are simply ignored. So Israel is constantly accused of having genocidal intent, doesn't bear very much scrutiny at all, frankly. But Hamas is excused when its clear objective is the obliteration of the Jewish people in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a case of projection. You accuse your enemy of the thing that you are guilty of. I mean, Hamas's constitution is clearly genocidal, and yeah, so that's what it is. You know, it's a reversal. There's been this constant comparison of the Jewish state to the Nazis, and yeah, the persecuting Christ. You know, the Palestinians are sort of Christ-like, and the Jews are trying to crucify Christ. It's really destructive and corrosive, I think, of righteousness. It's terrible.
Yeah, it's historically naive or ignorant of a lot of the history of what's happening there. But particularly in the context of our conversation, I think people would be horrified if they knew the fundamental ideology of Hamas. If they took the time to read what Hamas's charter is, they'd be horrified by it. And it's profoundly Islamist, and as Mark said, it's profoundly totalitarian. Even a baby is a soldier under Hamas. That's to be put to the service of destroying Israel. That's their charter. And I don't want to be too self-promoting, but Mark and I have actually had some conversations about this at Melbourne School of Theology where we work. They're up on YouTube as well if you want to dig more deeply into that ideological side of it, but it's deeply Islamist.
We come to the Middle East itself, which is Islamic, and it appears to be deeply divided. In fact, not everybody is with Hamas. And there are many countries around the place who don't seem to be with the Palestinians either. Quite glad to see them. They certainly don't want them in their own countries. Why is Egypt not taking people in?
Well, Jordan drove them out, decades ago because they were threatening to assassinate the king and overthrow the government. Egypt doesn't want them because they would be a force to destabilize Egypt. Another reason why Hamas is not always liked is that it's really a Muslim Brotherhood, a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood, whose kind of heartland is in Qatar, is really devoted to overthrowing governments throughout the Middle East and establishing an Islamic, a purified Islamic order. So the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in Egypt now after having taken over for a while, and the Saudis would have no patience for them. So the movement they represent is quite threatening to different regimes across the Middle East. They're happy for people might be happy for Hamas to fight Israel if that's the way they're inclined to think, but they don't want them on their turf. They don't want their influence. So it's very messy, the Middle East, and very complex. But Hamas is certainly not. It is used. I think Hamas is used just as they themselves are using the Palestinians.
What's the difference between Sunni and Shia communities in the Middle East, and how does that play out in their attitudes towards Israel in particular?
Well, the division occurred quite early in Islam. There was a dispute between a group that thought that there were rightly guided caliphs who had to be descendants of Muhammad. These were the Shia. And then the Sunnis who had a different view on the succession. It was a dispute over the succession issue. And Shia and Sunni have fought down the ages. And I suppose conventionally what they've tended to do is to say that the other is not the true Muslim. So the Sunnis would say Shia are renegades, they're not Muslims, and the Shia would say the same. And so when Iraq and Iran were fighting and millions died, each of them thought it was a holy war for Islam. So the struggle between Shia and Sunni approaches goes on. The Saudis have a significant Shia minority, for example, and there's also a struggle going on in the Islamic world for prestige, like who is going to be the leader of the Islamic revolution to establish Islam in the world? And the Iranians would like to say, we are. But the Sunnis, whether it's the Turks or the Muslim Brotherhood, or they say, well, we are going to be the ones. There's a hadith that says that there are many different sects that will arise, but only one is the true one. And so each one is trying to prove that they are the true one. So Sunni and Shia are set against each other. The Iranians are quite threatening, I think, for, say, the Saudis and others. If the Americans weren't there, I'd be very doubtful of the Gulf states' ability to withstand Iran. Iranians are generally highly educated and highly capable. And so that's quite a threatening presence. They've been fighting many proxy wars throughout the Middle East. So there's a battle. They might come together to support each other. Like the Iranian regime is very anti-Israel and always has been since the revolution in 1979. So they've been supporting Hamas against Israel. But fundamentally, if Israel wasn't there, the Hamas is Sunni and the Iranians are Shia, they'd be fighting each other. So it's a marriage of convenience that's happened in that the resources that the Iranians have provided to Hamas, which wouldn't endure if Israel was destroyed. So there's a big battle going on between the Sunni and the Shia world, and that's really the most most potentially threatening and destabilizing thing in the Middle East at the present time.
I'll make a comment and then a rhetorical question. I'm not going to ask you to comment on it, but a very, very, very senior British man who'd been involved in the Middle East told me of his disgust with the British Foreign Office for insisting that we need not understand these divisions, we need not understand Islam, because this is an age of secularism and religion is no longer shaping things. This is quite recent. And the rhetorical question is simply, I wonder whether the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra has enough people who actually understand some of these driving forces, these sort of motivational wellsprings, to be able to explain them to the government and to our own foreign minister. I'll just let that question sit.
I might dare to make one little comment on that. And Mark and I are both good friends with a academic who had a previous life working in the intelligence services in Australia, and he was working in the Middle East office, speaks Arabic, knows the situation very closely. There's at least one, I don't know if it's reassuring, but one dynamic is that I think people in the intelligence services know more than they let on, because one of the dynamics, at least in Australia, is that most of the intelligence we get on Islamism, and particularly jihadi or violent Islamism, comes out of the Muslim community. So the intelligence communities have to do a delicate dance of not painting the Islamic communities too negatively, because then they'll lose one of their sort of sources of intelligence. So I think you're right. I think behind closed doors, at least the intelligence services understand it, but I think the public discourse is entirely ignorant of it. And also in terms of the policy, whether the party rooms understand it, that's a whole other question.
Well, yes, but it's a very important question.
Yeah, it's a critically important question.
To this, who are thinking, we need to actually get across it. I just repeat Mark's line. It's not good enough to say we don't do religion, because it's confronting us with challenges that are not going to go away, and no one could say we're making a success of it at the moment. Look at the rise of anti-Semitism smashing the left's beloved multiculturalism in this country, and make no mistake, it is smashing it. The people in the streets of Australia are saying, was all of this such a good idea? One interesting question to my way of thinking is that of the differences again within the Islamic world. We live next door to the most populous Muslim country in the world. It's Indonesia, which coincidentally and very interestingly is perhaps one of the very few, if not the only significant Muslim country that is on quite a reasonable democratic trajectory. And I should say I'm an admirer of Indonesia and its people in many ways. And I enjoy their company, and I have many Indonesian friends. It seems different. It's almost as though, putting aside all of the divisions and all of the sections and subsections and Sharia, Sunni and Shia divisions and what have you, there's many Indonesians are, if you like, Indonesian Islamics rather than Islamic Indonesians.
I think it's complicated. So 25 years ago, there was an internal conflict in the eastern part of Indonesia where 500,000 Christians were internally displaced because of the activities of the Laskar Jihad, which is a militant organization which is often supported by the Indonesian army. So there have been some dark episodes in the history of Indonesia. But one thing to understand is that Indonesia is not as profoundly Islamicized as, say, Pakistan is. That there is a previously existing culture and tradition that Indonesia only came late to Islam. We're talking about the 16th century on, not that long before the Europeans arrived, actually. So Islam has come in, but it's come in over the top, and you've got other traditions existing as well. Islamization takes centuries, and only parts of Indonesia are more Islamized than others. So I think the difference is not enough Islam. It's not, I wouldn't say it's just a different kind of Islam. It is, but it's also not as Islamicized as, say, Pakistan is. So The question is, where will Indonesia be in centuries ahead? One really important point is that Indonesia is not an Islamic state. It doesn't have in its constitution a commitment to the supremacy of Islam, unlike, for example, Pakistan or Malaysia. So that offers protection. You can change your religion in Indonesia. It's not against the law. And Indonesia recognizes a set of religions. So it's Indonesian Muslims that have set that up. They have been the majority. They didn't want an Islamic state, but that could change in the future. It'd be interesting to see how that develops, because what we've seen in many countries over the last 50, 60 years is that there's been a trend towards more Islamization. The governance of Pakistan has moved towards more Islam. Bangladesh is similar. Turkey is similar. So I love Indonesia. I lived there in the most Islamic area. I love my time there. But what will the future hold? I think it's a long and slow process that we'll need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and we've touched before too on the sort of cultural elements of Islam, and wherever Islam goes, it wants to impose Arab culture in a sense, certainly traditional conservative Islam. And there are some places that can pull that off quickly and easily, and other places that it takes a bit longer. And Mark's right, there are pockets of very radical Islam in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Malaysia. But for the most part, the pre-existing culture was quite different, and it's taken quite a while for it to transform, and it's resistant, and there are sort of pre-existing belief systems too that are clinging on. But yeah, that's the question all the time is what's cultural, what's Islamic, and you have a totalitarian religion in Islam that is trying to swallow up all the culture, wherever it goes.
I'm not blind to what has happened.
Yeah.
And I'm not blind to some of those forces and the divisions and the ugliness of it and the persecution, particularly in the East, that's taken place. I would say that one Indonesian observer said to me that partly there's another difference, that many Indonesian people quite respect the Christians for the role they took during the days of independence, standing up for a better Indonesia, if you like, or more freedom for Indonesians, and then during the communist insurgency days. And so around 15%, that's quite different. Around 15% of Indonesian people are understood to be believers. And I myself have been to huge Christian events and witnessed too the extraordinary philanthropy and good deeds being done by many wealthy Indonesians. So perhaps some of those things drive some of the differences. It does bring you back again to the Middle East and their willingness to embrace modernity. It strikes me quite often that Israel, as a democracy and with a vibrant capitalist or free enterprise approach, has delivered very high living standards to its people. Why could Gaza not have become another Singapore? There seems to be quite a relationship between the adaptation of modernity, of modern economic prosperity and what have you, and these fundamental beliefs as well. What drives people in terms of their worldview? In other words, many Islamics would say, I presume Muslims would come to Australia looking for a better life. It's provided not only by democracy but also by free enterprise. And it's very striking to me that, in fact, this inability to embrace modernity, despite the apparent scholarship in much of the Arabic world centuries ago, there's a rejection of modernity at the great cost, really, to the living standards of many people who are under those regimes.
It's very striking that, around the Mediterranean, there are no real Islamic success stories. There's no Singapore or South Korea. And even Malaysia, which has sort of had a fair amount of development, that's, I think, driven along by the Chinese presence, particularly in Malaysia. I think Bernard Lewis once said that the whole of the GDP of the Middle East, apart from Israel and oil, is less than Finland. So why is the Middle East so poor? I think the reason often people give is, it's because of colonialism. But if that was true, Singapore wouldn't be successful because it was once colonized as well. I think it has to do with really quite deep cultural characteristics that Islam imparts to populations, which inhibit innovation and creativity. The Islamic view of education tends to emphasize obedience and not questioning. I mean, many Muslims I've spoken to said when they were growing up, when they went to school, it was not good to ask too many questions. It was frowned upon, and you were rebuked if you were asked the wrong question. So I think there are some cultural characteristics that make it difficult. I think the victimhood mentality makes it difficult. If you feel you're perpetually a victim of somebody else, it disempowers you. You don't take responsibility for your own life. It's complex. I think there's many reasons, but the Middle East is full of conspiracy theories and destabilizing movements towards more radical Islam. So, yeah, that's a tragedy. But at some point, when will people in the Middle East say we need to find a better way? We need to take responsibility for our lives.
There's also a theological angle to this as well, in that, and again, we're talking the conservative end of Islam when I say this, but their epistemology, their view of knowledge is the only really important knowledge is the knowledge that helps you to be a good Muslim. And so the Quran and the Hadith tell you the things that you need to put all your focus into. And so there are other things like maybe scientific research, or particularly speculative scientific research, and particularly philosophy and political philosophies that are not Sharia law. Like, you just ignore all those things because they're of relative unimportance. And so if the most important thing is just to be a good Muslim, then that works against being creative. It works against developing new things. It works against Mark was talking about the economic development, but there's so few Nobel Prize winners. There's so few strong universities. There's so many gaps in the Islamic world, and because that fundamental theology works against that.
Historically, one area where Islam has been quick to adopt technology has been in war technology. So Islam is because of the drive to be effective, will invest energy in military technologies. Yeah, not that they're advanced in doing it, but they will rapidly take up new opportunities, and that's always been the case.
Right, and even John, what you were talking about before, the sense that during the sort of the so-called golden age of Islam, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, around that time when they were strong, or the empire was strong, and they had universities. It's not entirely accurate that was due to Islam. It was certainly true that the rulers were, for the prestige of the empires, were trying to set up excellent universities, but many of the scholars were Christian. They weren't necessarily Muslim, and a lot of the work that was done was sort of un-Islamic, and eventually it was all shut down about the 12th century because it was becoming increasingly challenging to traditional Islam. And so, yeah, there's been a sort of a anti-intellectualism, if you like, to traditional Islam, going right back to the beginning.
I think the times of flourishing or great power in the Muslim world have been the centuries after conquest. You know, if France became Islamic, then there could be a flowering again. But those movements have tended to peter out over time. I think it was a Muslim physician that discovered the circulation of blood in the body, but no use was made of this and it was forgotten.
Osama bin Laden, who I think really shocked us into the reality that there are many people who hate the West, the bombing, the Twin Towers and so forth in America, used to refer to America as the Great Satan, I think Israel as the Little Satan, implying his utter disdain, I suppose you could say, for the West. It raises in my mind the question, What is the relationship between Islamic belief and dislike of, I suppose you'd say, Christians in the West, but particularly of the Jewish people? And we've been talking about Hamas's genocidal intent and its relationship to Islam. How does that play out?
So Islam's view is that the people of the book, which be Jews and Christians, can have a place in the Islamic State. They should surrender and live under Islamic rule. And Israel is offensive because it's a rejection of that principle. Muslims are not in charge in Israel, and it needs to be overthrown. Land once conquered should always belong to Islam. But in addition to that general view about Jews and Christians and their place under Islamic rule and dominance, the birth story of Islam, the life of Muhammad, the teachings in the Quran and the Hadiths have many highly derogatory comments about Jews. For example, there's a tradition that Muhammad told his followers, if you find a Jew, kill him, kill anyone who comes under your power. And the Jews are said in the Quran to be almost subhuman. Allah changed them into apes and pigs. They're said to be warmongering, but lacking in courage. They're said to be untrustworthy. You can't form a trustworthy pact with Jews. They are the source of all wars in the world. So what you see, and I read every day reports of sermons from the Middle East or from America or across Europe from Muslim sermons, is again and again these ideas in the Quran are injected into public discourse across the Muslim world, speeches by parliamentarians. It's a real belief that the Jews are evil, that they are treacherous, that they want to start wars, that you can't enter into peace agreements with them. This dehumanizes them, and it continually drives the war, because if there's an enemy which is inherently warmongering and also cowardly at the same time, you've got no other choice really but than to fight them. So, yeah, unfortunately, the Jews and also people that have left Islam are really intensely disliked in the Quran and the Sunnah. I would say that the fundamental sources of Islam are hardwired for anti-Semitism. In addition to that, you have European anti-Semitism, for example, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This has also influenced the Muslim world as well. But Islamic anti-Semitism is fundamentally not an import from Europe. It has its own characteristics and its own drivers. And yes, it's hugely influential.
The protocols, of course, have been shown to be a complete hoax. And yet the reality is that they're still trotted out, arguably even by New South Wales parliamentarians, making references to Jewish tentacles. The idea that they're everywhere, slimy, unseen, destroying the world, intent upon subjugation of everyone else. In fact, sounds a little like projection to me. I think you've used that term.
Yeah, I think the Islamic view is that Jews are weak, contemptible, warmongering, but cowardly. They love life more than death, and they won't fight if you're pushed. The European Christian tradition of anti-Semitism makes Jews out to be incredibly powerful, controlling the world, controlling America, controlling international finance. So those two kind of contradictory views, that Jews are weak and contemptible and they're incredibly powerful and threatening, that's all been mushed up together in one kind of terrible mix at the present time. So yeah, it's very sad. And when people say all religions are the same, or they say religion is irrelevant, religion is not a cause, it's structural injustices or colonialization, these are the real issues in the world. These are attempts to suppress an understanding of religion, but the fact is that at its core, Islam is very anti-Semitic. Muhammad massacred a whole tribe of Jews. He took women to be his wives from the Jewish captives. There is kind of his example is very clear. In fact, radical Muslims often chant, "You remember Khaybar, and remember Khaybar. The armies of Muhammad are coming back to destroy the Jews." And this is citing an example where Muhammad attacked and defeated Jews. So yeah, this is part of the problem. It's a religious stream that Islam has never come to terms with, has never really been acknowledged properly It's never been properly renounced, and yet it goes on. It's one thing to seek the dominance of Islam over non-Muslims, that they should be subjected and become second-class citizens. But it's another thing to have at your core a whole set of texts that declare the evil character and the weakness and the troublesome nature of the Jews. So, yeah, that's a great difficulty, I think.
So interestingly, the Islamic world has never thrown up figures like John Newton, William Wilberforce, and the group of friends that decided against their own interests and in the face of great hostility from their own culture that black people who'd been enslaved were fully human and should be freed. There's no equivalent movement about that recognition of the humanity of people who are downcast, have no power, different coloured skin, different culture.
That's true. And Islam orients people into different categories. So Muslims are superior. The Quran says you're the best people that have been raised up for humankind. You command what's right, you forbid what's wrong. And Jews and Christians are at a lower level, Hindus lower again. And I mean, even in Saudi Arabia, if you accidentally kill somebody, there are different amounts of money depending on whether they're male or female or Muslim or Christian. And, the value of people is reflected in the law in that way. So that's a big problem for Islam, is that it has a very unequal view of different kinds of people. And this drives a lot of difficulties throughout the Muslim world. It's very hard to establish democracy where people are treated as equal, that all are equal before God. That is really quite difficult with Islam, because Islam declares the superiority and the duty to rule of Muslims.
Richard, let me, on the back of that, ask you this question. The Islamic faith is, of course, founded on the Quran and the Hadiths. They're the source materials, if you like. Christianity is based on the Bible. Both have their critics, of course. Both have their supporters. I think you would probably argue that the Bible is a book that, for a whole variety of reasons, is more trustworthy and reliable. Would you argue that?
Yeah, of course. And you're right. There are a lot of facets to look into, a lot of questions to ask to do with reliability. But I think in a nutshell, what I want to say is, at least to a Muslim, that the reason I trust the Bible rather than the Quran, first in terms of its just historical reliability, is that it's been tested. And it's testable. Christianity has opened the Bible up to examination of its earliest texts. You can go into the British Library and you can see Sinaiticus, the earliest sort of full text we have, which is 300 years earlier than the Quran. And you can see it there. You can read it. It's open for examination, and people have tested it. And Christians have asked difficult questions about whether their texts are reliable. Whereas the Quran is both unquestionable. Muslims are told it's pure and perfect and completely unchanged, but it's never really been examined. In fact, it's only been maybe the last 15, 20 years that scholars around the world have had a really close look at the texts of the Quran. For example, Muslims are told the text has been unchanged, but it's just not true. The earliest texts that we have, all the texts are riddled with textual variants, all of them, every single one you find. Muslims don't know this because they're not really supposed to ask, and they never really look very closely. So there are good historical and textual reasons to think that the Bible is more reliable than the Quran. But then there's just the content, really. For me, when I read the Bible, I'm reminded of, I think it was Spurgeon who said, I'd sooner defend a lion than defend the Bible, in the sense that the content of the Bible can defend itself. I'd encourage Muslims to read a Bible and see what it says. And the God you meet there is extraordinary. He's not a God you'd make up. He's beautiful and rich and profound. And again, you wouldn't make Jesus up. Whereas the God you meet in the Quran is completely the sort of God you would naturally come up with as a human, that tells you that you're good, tells you can keep these rules, tells you that you're the best. And so I just encourage people, both by the content and the historical reliability, to look into the scriptures and see the God you meet there.
Because it immediately raises the one interesting aspect of all of this, which is a Muslim accepts that there is a higher authority who can intervene and do extraordinary things. Many secularists would say, well, no, the Bible can't be reliable because there can't have been a parting of the waters. There can't have been, people walking on water. There can't have been people brought back from the dead. There can't have been a resurrection. But at least with the Muslim community, you've got a vast difference there. Your starting point is that they actually believe that there is a divine being, whereas many in our culture now deny the supernatural or the transcendent.
I totally agree. And in fact, one of the sort of impressions you shouldn't get from this conversation, we've been focusing on Islam and many negative things perhaps, but yeah, in terms of just that general theism, that fundamental belief that there is a God who created the world and we are created purposeful and the supernatural is real and miracles are real and prophecy is real and scripture is real. Muslims are absolutely on board with all those things. They want some of the easiest people in the world to talk to about religion. In fact, they're disappointed and shocked that Christians won't talk to them about faith and about the scriptures. Now those conversations will be heated and enthusiastic, perhaps, but yeah, absolutely right. They're very easy to talk to about that. The starting point is way down the line.
You're both men of enormous intellect. I know that full well, and the numbers and the things after your name say that. But some people would be saying, well, this is the problem. All religions are obtuse. They all rely on ideas of the transcendent. They're all anti-scientific. You know those lines. As intelligent people, what would you say to people who say, let's just forget them all. They're all just as bad. Why is it rational to say there must be truth somewhere in these ancient faiths? And if you go looking, one is more credible than the others. Why should we?
Let me give you one quick answer that I'll hand over to Mark, and that is that Islam was private. The Quran is private. Muhammad was the only one who saw the visions or claimed the visions. Nobody else was there. But Christianity is public. And Jesus turned up in public. He's made his claims in public. He did his miracles, his actions in public. His death, his resurrection was all in public. And again, I just mentioned about testability. There's a sense in which it's testable and verifiable in a way that is radically different from virtually every other religion. Christianity is not an ideology. It's not a philosophy. It's not like Buddhism. It's absolutely grounded on historical claims and fundamentally grounded on the claim about Jesus' resurrection. So in that sense, it's not airy-fairy. It's not scientific. It's a historical claim. Science can't tell us about history at all. So science is not up to the task. But it is to do with reality and it is to do with history, and it's testable.
I think it's even if you don't have any view about the existence of God, you're an atheist or you're agnostic, I think it's actually just obvious that religions create different societies. That Saudi Arabia, which is so shaped by Islam, is very different from England, which is deeply shaped by Protestant Christianity. Of course, I mean, look at the difference between North and South Korea. And look me in the eye and say, politics doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference what political view you have. It's nothing to do with reality. Of course, ideology shapes societies. That's why North Korea is in one situation and South Korea is another one. And Christianity is also deeply influential in nations. Northern Europe, shaped by Protestant Christianity, is different from Southern Europe, shaped more by Catholic Christianity, and South America. It seems to be just like obvious that religions make a difference in shaping cultures. In addition to that, I would say, if you go on the journey and actually ask what has made Western Europe great, and you follow Tom Holland's exploration, and you see that the fundamentals of Western European culture have been deeply shaped and benefited from Christianity, and you see that there are reasons that Christianity has been successful. Even if you're an atheist, you say, well, I'm a cultural Christian because I'd rather have a Christian culture than other cultures, as a number of atheists have been saying. you just face up to the reality that if God is real, if there is a supernatural God, then why wouldn't he interact supernaturally with us? Why is that so illogical to believe in a miracle if you believe in a God who's powerful and real? There's nothing illogical about that. I think one of the great things about Christianity is it encourages the use of reason, and it's been the foundation of science in the West. And we shouldn't see that choice to be religious as sort of anti-intellectual or ignorant. It's some of the greatest minds in human history have been deeply Christian and very reasonable and rational. And so I think I'm a Christian from experiencing the power of God, seeing God work supernaturally in the world around me, absolutely. But also I find that it's a reasonable faith. It's a faith founded on the value of reason, the importance of reason. So people shouldn't be afraid of losing their reason just by believing that there is a God.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, we've had a very, very wide-ranging discussion indeed. To round this out, because it goes to the heart of you two men as princes of peace, if I can put it that way, and I think this is really important in terms of finishing up. You've both dedicated your lives actually to being friends, or big parts of your lives, to being friends of Muslim people. I know that. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. Really important to state here and now that far from being hostile to Muslim people, you seek to be their friends. Can you tell us a little about, I know, Mark, you and I have talked about this. I've not talked about it with Richard directly. The experience of people who go looking from the Muslim world, who go looking for something better. Many of them have come through your doors. What's that experience look like? Oh, and would you say they find a sense of freedom when they embrace Christian faith?
Yeah, I mean, both of us will have things to share. I really do love Muslim people, and I don't see them as enemies or people to be opposed or fought against. One of the things I'd say to Christians again and again when they ask me, how can I share faith? How can I reach out to my Muslim friends? I say, well, reach out to them, make friends with them, invite them to your home, share meals with them, show them what your life is like. I've seen many people from Muslim backgrounds becoming Christians, seeking Christ. I think they're looking for Jesus, and they encounter Jesus in the Bible. One young man became a Christian because he saw a single verse of something that Jesus said, and he said, I've never heard of anything like that before, and changed his life. My experience with Iranians particularly is many have a lot of trauma in their life. They're highly stressed. And one of the reasons they embrace Christ is they attend a church and they sense the peace that exists, the peace between people. The reason why their lives are stressed is because it's very competitive. They're always fighting for their survival. There's a fear of hostility from others. There's often a history of violence and trauma in their own family. The state has been against them. So seeking peace is huge, and the love of God, and also knowing a God who is personal and has a personal care for them. They can worship God in their own language, which is instead of Arabic, which they feel is alien to them and not their own mother tongue. And I also see that God is working a lot. People often have visions and dreams of Jesus or of things that lead them to Christ. So the Holy Spirit is working in people's lives all across the Middle East. All these problems we've been talking about, the problems that Islam faces in the modern world, many Muslims are keenly aware of that, and they're seeking for a different way. They're hungry to find spiritual truth. And I think it's actually an incredibly exciting time to be making friends with Muslims, to be sharing faith with them, to understand them better. This is a great time to be alive for people who have a heart for Muslims and love them and want to share Christ with them. So, yeah, that's been one of the great joys of my life, actually, to see God at work in the lives of Muslim people.
Yeah, I agree with all that Marcus said. John, we didn't talk earlier, but my sort of pathway into studying Islamic philosophy, that's my PhD is in philosophy, was wanting to understand how Muslim people thought. I wanted to know their frameworks and their belief systems, and so I could have good conversations, because I was living and working in a Muslim context, and conversations were sort of passing ships in the night, wasn't working, and I thought I want to get where they're coming from. And like Mark, I love Muslims. They're my friends. They're my neighbours. I don't believe Islam is true, and I think Christianity is both true and beautiful, and a profound benefit compared to Islam following it. But yeah, love Muslims and want to talk well with them. And I would also agree with Mark that the thing, as I've seen Muslims come to faith in Jesus, not so much, there's been a sense of freedom, I suppose, but love would be the dominant word I think that they use, both discovering that God is a God of love, or also seeing the love of Jesus. They're fascinated by Jesus. Virtually all Muslims are fascinated by Jesus. He's called the Messiah in the Quran. But if you ask any Muslim what a Messiah is, they have no idea, because there's so little about Jesus really of any substance in the Quran, and virtually nothing of what he says. So they're fascinated by him, and when they discover him, as Mark said, either in the Bible or there are visions, or there are just Christians teaching them, they're blown away by it. They fall in love with him, and sort of aligned with that is being loved by Christian community. Finding a community of grace. Not all Christian communities get it right all the time, but my experience of churches over the journey has been that they're full of people who also love and are wanting to find it and wanting God to transform them, and they love grace and they're trying to live that way, and asking God for their help. And Muslims see that and they are blown away by that.
Yeah.
Well, that's the ideal spot at which to say, thank you very much indeed, and I hope this conversation will be illuminating for a lot of people. It's conducted out of a concern for people's well-being everywhere. The only note I would add that is that whilst it's absolutely right for us to display the meekness and the gentleness and the willingness to love our enemies, I believe that to be profoundly right, the model that was set for us. It is also right that governments, though, should seek to protect their people against violence and against discordant activities that disrupt and threaten. So there is a distinct role for our governments not to be naive and to be prepared to stand to defend those who are increasingly likely to be victims of bad behaviour. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Great to talk.
Yeah, thanks for having us.